As we sang that first song, there was a lyric in there that it just repeated over and over. It just said, "We're in awe of you." Have you guys seen anything lately that just makes you in awe of God? You can clap to that. I just returned from a little vacation to the great state of Idaho. Anybody out there? Who was the woo? Who was the one? Yeah, woo. Which was funny because I was listening to Pastor Scott, and he was saying how we were switching positions. And I almost feel like I switched positions with Pastor Danny because I returned. I saw him for about 15 seconds, and then he actually left for Montana. So if you're wondering where he's at, he's actually teaching some students returning from mission in the state of Montana. This morning, we're going to jump right in for the sake of time. If you have a Bible, I would love for you to grab it with me. We're going to be in the book of Matthew today. And before we get specific about chapters and verses, I kind of want to set the stage for you. I want to give you some context to the book of Matthew. You see, we run the risk sometimes of saying, let's just say, for instance, we're going to jump right into Matthew 16. But if you've ever read a gospel, it's a story, isn't it? And every episode in the story builds on top of itself. So if we don't know what happened before that, we're going to have a hard time understanding the ramifications of what we're reading. Everybody just nod your head and humor me. Yeah, great. So I want to tell you a little bit about Matthew. You see, Matthew, like the other Gospels, was written to a specific group of people, and it was written for a specific original purpose. And Matthew is so concerned that people are struggling because they are having a hard time figuring out what it means to live here and now and also be citizens of this thing called the kingdom of heaven. Does anyone relate with that at all? Yeah. And Matthew is saying we are living in tough times. Anybody relate with that at all? And he begins to unfold this story. And at first, he just introduces us to this guy, Jesus, and we know the end of the story. We know we're here because we're proclaiming that he's the Lord. But when Matthew writes those first few chapters, he's starting to make a case for those original people of what the identity of this Jesus is. Does that sound like a story worth reading to you? So I want to tell you one of the first stories. I'm going to paraphrase it. You don't need to turn there. It comes in Matthew chapter 2, and I think this ultimately will set the stage for us. It's the story of these three foreigners. We call them wise men. We talk about it around Christmas time. And Matthew has told us the genealogy of where Jesus came from. And then all of a sudden, we switch scenes. Jesus is no longer in the scene. We get these three wise men, magi we call them. And they come from the east, and they come walking into Jerusalem, and they knock on the door of the palace where King Herod lives. And King Herod at the time, he's a puppet king. The empire called Rome has put him there to oversee these people. And he has this affectionate nickname. He's called King of the Jews. And these wise men, we call them wise men. Why? Because they're wise, right? They knock on the door and they say, "Excuse me, Herod. We have been watching this star, and there's a child. He's been born. He is the King of the Jews, and we've come to worship him. You think that we're going to have any problems here?" Right from the beginning, this is what Matthew wants you to know. You are living in a time and a place that might say that King Herod is the king of the Jews, but I want you to know that this story is presupposing that there's a different one who's the true king. And so from here on, Matthew begins to unfold his story, and he's telling us every step of the way that if we are going to proclaim that this Jesus is the true king, there is going to be certain things expected of us. And so we come to Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. If you know your Bible well, you know that that is called the Sermon on the Mount. And it's called a sermon because Jesus does a lot of talking. Anybody got a red letter Bible, by the way? Yeah, all of a sudden we went from like black letters to a ton of red letters. Jesus just starts talking. And he starts telling us about what it means to follow Jesus as a citizen of this new kingdom. The one that says that Jesus is the king, not Herod. And he tells us all sorts of things. Some of it even makes us uncomfortable. He starts and he says things like, "Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," right? He's recasting our imagination for how we are going to see people in this new kingdom. And then chapter 6 is the pivotal moment that I want to start with this morning. You see, this is where we get this prayer. We call it the Lord's Prayer. Raise your hand, by the way. Do you know the Lord's Prayer? There's this little piece in the Lord's Prayer, and this is what Jesus says we should pray. He says, you should pray that God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You see, Matthew, if we're going to understand Matthew this morning, we have to know that Matthew is presupposing that God's kingdom, God's heavenly kingdom, is coming on earth right now. What we do right now matters. We're not just waiting around, waiting for the bus to show up to take us to heaven, and man, that'll be a great day. It will be. But Matthew says what happens here and now matters. And so he starts telling us things in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about how the laws are different. You may have heard that it was said about like this about murder, but I'm telling you there's something different going on about murder, right? And then he gets into that really comfortable section where he starts telling you what to do with your money. You guys remember that? So we enter Matthew chapter 8, which is where we're going to be this morning. If you have your Bible, it'll also be on the screen for you. Every step of the way, if we're going to understand any part of Matthew, we're going to have to circle back and ask ourselves this question. What is this telling us about what it means to be a citizen of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven? And we're going to ask that question throughout this morning. We're going to go through these 3 consecutive miracle stories. And I just want to jump right in because I think there's a lot of power to the first story. Do we have it on the screen? Matthew chapter 8, verse 1. You can follow along. It says this. When he came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now, I don't know about you. I live in the city of Irvine. Any others in here? I don't walk out my door and see a lot of lepers. Anybody else? Everybody else have the same experience in life? There's not a lot of lepers walking around, so I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a leper. Many of you know the basics of leprosy, right? It's a contagious, nasty skin disease. It starts with maybe some white blotches, and it moves towards disfiguring your skin. It might be lumpy. And then over time, your skin starts to rot off your body. But it's not just a physical disease in the first century. You see, there's certain laws in place to deal with lepers. Let me set this scene for you. Jesus is coming off of a mountain, and he's coming down to this city called Capernaum. On his way, there is not a Walgreens, there's not a CVS, there's no place to get medication. Everybody on the same page here? So leprosy is a big deal, and here's why. It's not only contagious, but it is permanently contagious. If you have it, you have it. This isn't a cough, this isn't a fever, you got leprosy. And so this is what the law is. If you like this sort of thing, you can dig in your free time. It's from Leviticus chapter 13. It's actually a chapter where the heading says on what to do with contagious skin diseases. If that sort of thing is interesting to you, have at it. I'll spare you. It says that if you were to have maybe a white spot on your skin, you would go to the local priest in the synagogue and you would show him. And if he determined that you indeed had leprosy, you started this terrible, terrible process for the rest of your life. And it began like this. Every piece of clothing that you've ever worn needs to be burned. Your bedding, your blankets, everything, burn it, right? Maybe you have a job working with horses or something, your saddle, whatever it is, burn it, okay? The second thing is this. Say your goodbyes very quickly because you are no longer welcome in town. That job you've been working for, not our problem anymore, right? That family that you've spent so much time investing in, not our problem anymore. We cannot have you around. Now, I want to emphasize one point here that's going to be essential for us to understand this leper. You see, to be pronounced unclean by a priest has one other huge ramification, and that is this. In the first century, to worship God meant that you had to enter the temple or the synagogue. That is how you worshiped God. To be diagnosed with leprosy was to be told you are no longer welcome in the assembly where we worship God. And so lepers were given a choice. They needed to move outside of town. They were given maybe a plot of land, and it wasn't good land, by the way. No water. In fact, it was a crime for lepers to drink out of certain parts of the stream. Probably not good soil to grow food, and so they moved into areas that I would just call no man's land. It probably is not a surprise to you that many lepers in the first century just decided suicide was a better option. And so this is the guy that we encounter in Matthew chapter 8. And it says this: Jesus is coming down from the mountainside. Large crowds had followed him. And a man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Now, I've been wrestling with this story quite a bit in the last week. You see, I think that the more I study and the more I research, the more I pray and try to discern what is going on in this story, the more I realize there's two really, really good ways to read this story. If you've heard this story before, you've probably heard it this way: that this leper who's been told, you may not enter town, you cannot come in contact with people. In fact, if people are within earshot, you're supposed to yell out, "Unclean, unclean, don't come near me." He gets the boldness and the courage, and he decides life isn't worth living unless I can just get to Jesus. And so he works up all of his courage, he goes into town, and he comes before Jesus, and he asks for healing. I got to tell you, I love that way to read the story. And I think it's a great way to read the story, but this week I was introduced to a different way that I think might even pack a little bit more of a punch. Are you ready? Yes. I want you to imagine for a second that Jesus is up on this mountainside. He's given his Sermon on the Mount, and he's coming down the mountain, okay? We know that he's heading towards this little fishing village called Capernaum or Capernaum. People say it different ways. And if you looked on a map, you would realize that between the mountain and Capernaum is this big plain, and this plain is not a good plain. It's got nothing going for it. It has no good water. It has no good crops that you can cultivate there. It is no man's land. Are you following me yet? This is the perfect place for a leper to be. This is leper territory. Now, I want to tell you one other thing that I was reading this week I found interesting. In the 3rd century, a Jewish rabbi wrote to his followers. He was a very influential rabbi. And he said, if you were to come in contact with a leper, that should be your greatest fear of your entire life. You should run the opposite direction. If you have control, you shouldn't even stand downwind from a leper. It would be better to be dead than be a leper. So, what's the second way of reading this story? As I looked at it, as I thought about it, it makes perfect sense to me, and I want you to imagine this. Is it possible that Jesus, with hundreds of people who know the worst thing that could possibly happen would be to come in contact with a leper, is it possible that Jesus intentionally led an entire crowd into leper territory? Can you imagine the scene when this leper shows up? These are people who know run. If I thought life was bad enough as a blind guy who was healed, I don't want leprosy. I am out of here, right? If we could put verse 3 on the screen, we're going to wrap up this story. You know, sometimes when we translate the Bible from Greek to English, it kind of gets a little wonky, but I think this did us such a great favor here. You see, there's a period, a full stop, and look at what it says on the top line here. Jesus reached out his hand and he touched the man. You notice that his touching the man happens before he's been cleansed? He touches the man, the very thing that would say Jesus is now unclean, Jesus is now unfit to go in a synagogue or a temple. The Son of God freely and openly touches him. And then he says, I am willing, be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. As we wrap up this story, I want to point out one last thing. We talked about it this morning in my Bible study upstairs with the kids. You see, Matthew, of all the Gospels, experts say Matthew has just an unbelievable grasp of language. He's a wordsmith. He's a genius when it comes to writing. Which, by the way, does it surprise anyone that God would choose somebody who's just a genius writer to write the story? But here's the thing I want you to notice. This man does not come to Jesus and say, Jesus, can you cure my leprosy? He says, Jesus, can you make me clean? And there's a big difference. This word is, it's a ceremonial washing word, and this is what he's ultimately saying. He's saying, Jesus, my leprosy is the thing I need cleansing from, but I need full cleansing so that I can go back into real life. So that family that I spent so much time investing in, I can go back to it. The job that I created, I can go back to it. The synagogue that I want to worship in, I can go back to it. And so Jesus' miracle of cleansing this man is not simply eliminating his leprosy, although that is definitely something that happens. What he does is he eliminates every barrier and obstacle for this man to live in fullness of life. And so as we wrap up this one miracle story out of 3, we have to circle back and we have to ask ourselves this question I proposed to you at the beginning. What does this story mean for us? We're trying to live as citizens of the kingdom of heaven on earth. What does this mean for us? I want to propose 3 things that I think this means for us. The first one is this, that to follow Jesus means that we need to participate in reaching people that nobody wants to touch. You see, it's not a mistake that Jesus touches this man before he's cleaned of his leprosy. That to follow Jesus is to be led into places that we might be uncomfortable with, that we might not feel totally safe. And it's ultimately to touch people that nobody wants to touch, that the kingdoms of the world say, do not get near that guy. The second thing is this, is that we're not just reaching people for the sake of patting ourselves on the back and saying, yeah, we reached a lot of people. The reason we reach people is because God has a plan in place. His mission in the world is to restore people back into who he created them to be. To follow Jesus is to participate in restoring people back into who God created them to be. And the third thing is this, that it's not enough. We see in Jesus, it's not enough just to restore. He tells him, go. Go do what you have to do. Go in the temple. Let the priest see that you have leprosy no more, because I'm releasing you back into the fullness of life. Here and now. Reach, restore, release. Jesus isn't done. By the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I love the fact that Jesus comes right off the Sermon on the Mount, where he's doing tons and tons of talking, and he doesn't even field questions. Do you guys notice that? You ever go to like a college lecture or something, and it's like, wow, that was really deep. Can I ask some questions? Jesus says, no time for questions. It's time to start doing what I just told you, and I'm going to show you how to do it. Pretty cool. Well, Jesus goes right into another miracle story, and it says this in chapter 8, verse 5. It says, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. And the centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. But just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And I tell that one to come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and from the west, and they will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go. It will be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that very hour. As we jump into this story, I think it needs some unpacking. Just like lepers, I don't walk outside and see Roman soldiers very often. And I want to talk a little bit about who is this guy. Some of this is probably old news to you. Some of it might be new. But we have to set the stage if we're going to understand what's going on with this Roman military member. The first thing I want you to know is that a centurion in the Roman military is not that high of a rank. It's kind of on the lower end of the spectrum. And this word centurion, it has the same prefix like century. He's probably over about 100 men. Okay? Everybody following? And the reason it's important is because for a young military member, certain things were expected of him. Okay? To get in this position, Rome, they looked around and they realized, what is every other military in the whole world doing wrong? We're going to not do that. So this is what they did. If you were a young military member, if you got promoted to an officer and you wanted to, get higher and higher in the ranks, the first thing they required is that you cannot be married. That responsibility, that honor will be given to you if you prove yourself worthy. Your job as a young man is having no wife, no kids. If you are the oldest son and your job right now is to be taking care of your parents, find someone else to do it or you can't have the job. And here's why. The Romans had discovered that if they allowed young men to get married and they deployed men 2,000 miles away to the edge of the empire, which, by the way, on foot takes quite some time to get there, and they saw how brutal the battles were, guess what a lot of guys did? I'm out of here. I'll defect. I'll go home. There's no credit card trail for you to follow me, right? I don't have a social security number, right? So they defected. So Rome decided no more wives. That will be something that we gift people permission for. And this is important for the story because what we find out in history is that people became lonely. They had no one to go home to, except there was this loophole. Because servants and slaves do not count as human beings in the first century. So you can have as many of them as you'd like. And so it appears this young centurion has a servant at home, someone who generally is regarded as not a human being. In fact, if you want to know the truth, you could take the life of your servant without permission. You don't need Rome's permission, just do it. This is somebody who should be treated as the lowest of the low, and it appears that this centurion's heart is geared towards traveling a great distance to make sure that this guy is okay. And so he comes into Capernaum. Now, I want to just give you some illustration a little bit about this town, Capernaum, because it's, in my opinion, it's a really cool town. Any surfers out there? Anybody like to surf? Not that many. Okay, woo-woo. Well, you've probably heard the stories because it gets on the news, right? There's this little thing that happens sometimes in surfing. It's called localism. It's basically a group of guys who are like, this is our wave. If you paddle out, you may have heard this, beat it, kook, you don't belong, right? We've never seen you here before. Why are you here? Who told you about this place, right? This is Capernaum. Capernaum is a fishing village on the sea, and it is not Roman influenced. Mostly because Rome didn't care for it. It's just a little village on the sea. It can't produce enough fish, enough food, enough water to have a bunch of people there. And so they just decided, forget it, we don't need it. And we know that because Rome never put soldiers there, and they never built a wall around it. Everybody following? So here's why it matters. Because a Roman soldier comes marching into town, and he represents every single thing this town hates. They don't want him in town. Beat it, kook, right? Shaka? Beat it. You don't belong here. You're not welcome here. And he comes to Jesus. Now, let's talk a little bit about this crowd following Jesus. What kind of people are following Jesus at this point? These are outcasts. These are people who have been pushed to the margins. These are people who have been demeaned to the point where they feel that they have no value. These are people who have no life prospects, so much so that they just decide, I'll leave what life I have behind to follow him because I got nothing else going on. And we have to remember how they got that way. It's people like this guy. Rome has overtaxed us. The harvest wasn't good. We barely had enough to eat, and then they came knocking on our door and they took half of it, right? We raised a really promising son. He was so smart, so intelligent, so physically gifted. And guess what? They come and basically kidnap him and force him to work for them. We hate Roman soldiers. We have to know that. And so this guy comes into town. He's from a different town. I have to imagine people are jeering. Maybe somebody spit on him. They're probably booing. But more than anything, they're expecting something to happen. This is the first time that Jesus is going to get to be face-to-face with their enemies, right? What is going to happen? Finally, Jesus is going to get to put someone in his place. The guy that we hate, the guy who made everybody's lives miserable, Jesus gets to put him in his place. And it says this, Lord, this is verse 6, he said, it's my servant, he lies at home, he's paralyzed, and he's in terrible suffering. Well, stinks for you, bro, right? You don't belong here. Beat it. That's what everyone wants Jesus to say, right? And this is what Jesus says. I'll go with you and heal him. Can you imagine the reaction of the people? You'll do what? You're going to leave all of us? We've left everything to follow you. Now you're just going to leave us and go with our enemy to go help him heal somebody who doesn't really account for much? That's your idea of encountering your enemy? But Jesus is not content just with this, because the young man replies, and this is what he says. Ultimately, this is what he says, verses 8 through 9. He says, listen, Jesus, I'm a military man. I know authority when I see it, and I know how it works because I do it. I tell people, do this, do that, and they do it. And because I know authority when I see it, I can tell you have it, and you have so much of it, I'm not even worthy to have you in my home. The amount of authority I recognize you having, you could just say it and it would happen. And then for the first and the only time in our New Testament, it says that Jesus was taken aback. Literally, he was astonished. And he says this. It says, when he heard this, he was astonished. And then he turns and tells all these people that hate Roman soldiers, I tell you the truth, I haven't found anyone in Israel with such great faith as this guy. Not only am I willing to leave you behind to go help him, but also I just want you to know he has phenomenal faith. So much so, he says, that there is not this much faith in Israel. Remember that little group of people that was created to glorify God and be his reflection to the whole world? Jesus says there's not even faith like that in Israel. And then they're like, oh, okay. Have you ever heard somebody teach something and they don't elaborate enough so it's like up for interpretation? You know what I'm talking about? Like, you could kind of bend this way or that way. If you watch politics, this happens all the time. I didn't think that was funny, but... Jesus doesn't want to leave it up for interpretation, so he just continues. Oh, you guys are mad at me now. Wait until you hear what I'm about to say to you next. There's going to be this abundant, overflowing feast at the end of time. And you're going to want to be there because why? Because all your heroes are going to be there. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're going to be at the table. And all you Israelites, you're going to show up for the party because you just assume you're invited. And you're going to look around and you're going to realize there's no seat for you. And you're going to be upset because you're going to look around and guess who's sitting there? A Roman soldier is sitting in the spot that you thought was yours. And then you're going to get cast out. I don't have time this morning to go into depth about weeping and gnashing of teeth. But if you're taking notes, you could write this down. I guarantee you what that means for sure is that you're not part of the feast. That you're on the outside looking in. Have you ever been really hungry and had to watch someone else eat? Jesus turns back to the man. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, it will be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that very hour. I want to circle back. I want to ask this question we've been asking all along. What is this story, this miracle story that inspires us, that sounds so awesome? What does it mean for us here and now? We too are living on earth and we're trying to act as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. What does it mean for us? The first thing I think it means is this, that just after reaching out to the filthy leper, Jesus is now openly and blatantly reaching out to his enemies. To follow Jesus means to be not only willing, but desire to reach people that nobody wants around. I love this part of the story because Jesus literally, as Jesse Macias pointed out this morning, he literally just got done talking about loving your enemies in Matthew chapter 7, and the group of people who follow him down are like ready to throw rocks at the soldier. It's like, blows my mind, right? So if This story, what does it mean for us? It means, first of all, we have to be really willing to reach out to our enemies. Second of all, the reason we reach out to our enemies is because God, too, wants them to be restored into fullness of life. Even God's enemies get a face-to-face contact. And how does God interact with his enemies? He loves them. He's willing to leave the 99 behind for the one. And he said, I want to restore your household, the one that gives you joy, the one that gives you expectation when you come home. And the third thing is this, is that we reach and we restore so that we can release people back into the life that they were called to live. And I got to say, there's something amazing about this guy who can recognize the humanity in a person that nobody else recognizes the humanity in. We're going to wrap up with the third and final story this morning. Before we do, I want to give you a little bit of background. You see, the New Testament is written in this language called Greek, and Greek literature is famous for this tool that they use in their writing. So, maybe you have a fourth or fifth grader who's learning how to do all these rhyme exercises on their English homework. You guys know what I'm talking about? And you're learning how to use all these devices for how to write well. Anybody ever do an SAT prep class? I once sent an SAT prep essay in, thinking wow, that was a pretty good one. And I sent it into some, I don't know, budget agency or something. And it came back full of red. I didn't know the devices. But I want to tell you about a Greek literary device. It's called a literary triad. Say triad. It's literally the most simple thing you can imagine. This is all it is. It's that intentionally you get 3 stories in a row with the exact same theme because the author knows that maybe readers aren't as smart as him, and he doesn't want you to miss the theme. Make sense? The second thing about a triad is this, that the reason the theme is repeated is because the third story is the one that packs the punch. It's the one that he saved for the end to make sure that you know that this is the theme and this is why it matters. Does that make you excited to read the third story? Well, here it is. Verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand and the fever left her. And she got up and she began to wait on him. Wow, right? There's no literal head scratchers. I just scan the room. How does this story pack any punch whatsoever? Coming off the heels of a leper and a centurion, this just seems like I don't know if miracles are easy for Jesus, but it seems like if they were, this would be the easiest one, right? How does this pack a punch? Well, I want to talk for a second about this woman. You see, in the first century, the oldest woman in the house had a great honor and privilege. And it sounds, I know this doesn't fit well with modern feminism or something, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is for women in 2016. In the first century, the oldest woman in the house had the responsibility of making sure her home was ready and prepared for welcome and hospitality. That anyone who entered her door, every part of the household, how it was run, reflected her and reflected her family. And her ultimate goal was to make sure that honor was brought to her family. When you're walking in the market, somebody might say, oh my gosh, did you go to her house? It was impeccable. The food was amazing, right? The cookies, the brownies, wow. I don't know if they ate those back then. But here's the thing. We talked about this with leprosy. A fever is a contagious disease. It's technically a symptom, but in the first century, people thought fever was an actual disease. But it was temporarily contagious. And so if you got a fever, your job was to just separate from people, right? God forbid, I said this morning to the kids, God forbid you give the Son of God a fever, right? History would not be kind to you. If it was then Jesus was doing miracles, but then he got a fever, so he had to take a few days off, darn woman, right? So she secludes herself. She lies in bed. And she does it on purpose. The other thing I want to point out to you, I told you that Matthew is a genius with words. We just got done with a story where he gives us a description of somebody who's sick, they're paralyzed, they're suffering, they're going to die, right? Matthew knows how to tell us if someone is on the brink of death, and he doesn't do it here. If she was on the brink of death, you'd think that maybe one of the disciples would speak up and say, hey, she's like really sick, Jesus, you should help her, right? Somebody this morning said, insert mother-in-law joke here, right, for Peter, but I don't know if that's appropriate. Maybe if she was so sick, she was on the brink of death, maybe she would groan from the other room like, Jesus, please help me, right? She doesn't do it. She doesn't do it because she isn't that sick. She has a fever. She knows fevers. Drink a lot of water. Get some rest in the bed. You'll be fine in a few days. Now, I got to tell you, if you're still wondering, how does this pack a punch? I started hanging around churches when I was about 15 years old, and I've been to so many churches and seen so many congregations, and I got to tell you that across the board, Christians are so good at rallying around emergencies. If somebody is in need, Christians rock, right? We'll sign up for meals. You don't even have to ask, right? We'll visit in the hospital. We'll show up to your kids' games. We'll drive rides around. Whatever you need, we'll do it, right? But I also know that in that culture of rallying around emergencies, a lot of little things get brushed under the rug. I don't want to bother anyone. My problem is tiny compared to so-and-so. I would hate to take up somebody's time or resources, so I'll just keep quiet. Why bother, right? And so we have this woman. She doesn't ask to be healed. None of the disciples ask for Jesus to heal her. It's just a small thing, right? Jesus is the guy who deals with lepers and paralyzed people who are about to die. We shouldn't bother him with just a little fever. And Jesus enters the house, and the first thing he notices is her little fever. And he walks right up to her. He reaches out his hand. He restores her back to health and releases her back into what she's called to do, to wait on them. I would say that packs a punch. I think that hits home for all of us. Not all of us are dealing with leprosy or something serious. All of us are dealing with little things. And the message this morning, the punch that is packed, is that God notices. Even the things that you don't want to say out loud because you don't want to bother anybody or look like you're overly needy. God notices those things. What does this story mean for us as people living on earth trying to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven? It means that we need to be willing to reach out. To reach out to something like this, we have to notice the small things. We will have to be people who, through prayer and through exercise, are people who God is transforming to see even the small things. The reason we do it is because we want people, even people who are just minorly suffering, to be restored so that they can live out of fullness of life that God created them to live. This morning we're going to wrap up. Ben and the worship team are going to come up behind me. As they do, I want to read the last two verses of this section as we wrap up. Chapter 8, verse 16 says this. It says, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities, and he carried our diseases. I want to tell you this morning that Jesus does those last miracles with unnamed people. He does them from the doorstep of this woman's house. Because he noticed those small little things, he empowered her to serve him in such a way that now her house has become the central location in the entire town where people are coming. That is what's at stake if we are able to notice the small things this morning. Ben and the worship team are going to lead us in one worship song. I want to challenge you that as we sing that maybe you would take some quiet space. Maybe you would just ask that God would begin to do a work in you. Maybe that he would give you the eyes to see, as the Bible says, or the ears to hear, not just the big cries for help. We're good at that. But maybe that God would help us tune our eyes and our ears to see and hear the little needs among us. So let's worship God together.
You have my heart, and I am yours forever. You are my strength, God of grace and power, and everything, everything you hold in your hands. Still you make time for me. Can't understand, so praise you, God. Praise you, God. Earth and sky.
As we wrap up this morning, I just want to leave you with a couple things that you could take with you. The first thing I'm sure you've gathered is this, that to be citizens of God's kingdom is to say that we want to share it. And we want to share it in all sorts of places. We want to share it on top of mountains with crowds around, right? We want to share it on the plain in leper territory, in the back alleys where nobody is supposed to go, to people who nobody's supposed to talk to or reach or touch. We're supposed to do it right in the middle of town, in our workplaces. We're supposed to do it in the privacy of our own homes. And I'm blown away how Jesus brings the kingdom of heaven, and he does it through action. And he does it everywhere with all people. He does it with the crowds. He does it with a leper. He does it with a Roman soldier, his very enemy. He does it with an ailing woman who's content just remaining quiet in her own home. The reason we do it is not because we have a kingdom that's better. The reason we do it is because God has a kingdom that's better. Remember that story? It ends like this, that people bring others to Jesus. That is the whole point of us participating in reaching, restoring, and releasing people, is not to say, look at me, look at all my powers, look at my ability to do all of these things for people. It's to say, I'll bring you to Jesus, and I'll participate along with him. This morning, that is the message for us. That as you go, that remember, if you don't remember anything else, just remember this. As a citizen of God's kingdom, we are called to be reachers, restorers, and releasers, which is a great segue of saying that we are released back into the world. This isn't our final spot. Church is for us to come so that we can be sent out to do the very thing I've been talking about. I would love to pray for us as we go. When I'm done, if you could use prayer, if you need just somebody to talk to, there will be staff members up here to pray and talk with you. So would you pray with me? God, we recognize today the tension and maybe even the conflict that happens when we say that you are the true king. not Herod, not Caesar, not anybody else that we can imagine, but you are. And we know full well to say that comes with certain requirements of us. And we know that you don't require things of us that burden us and push us down, but you give us the opportunity to be your hands and feet in the world. So we pray today that you would empower us, that you would teach us, that you would transform us, so that we may operate out of being reachers, restorers, and releasers, that we would bring people to your doorstep. God, we ask this humbly, and we ask it in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. You are dismissed.